Yeah, just Dauphinais.
Hmm.
It's French Canadian. So
I see. Um, it's a great honor to welcome Professor Michael Dauphinais to this podcast. He is the professor of Catholic theology at Ave Maria University. Um, he hosts a podcast also called the Catholic Theology Show, and but in this hour we're discussing his free online course on Ave Maria on the wisdom of C.S. Lewis. Michael, welcome to the show. How are you?
glad to be here this morning.
All right. First, tell us about the Catholic Theology Show. What do you do there?
So that's a podcast we've been running for about almost 2 years now. We started on the feast of John Paul II, October 22nd in 2022. And it's really to kind of open up the theology classroom for so many people who never get to be in it, or students who were in the classroom as alums, parents. I think we have a kind of a vibrant interest in theology and learning it, but in many ways it really is confined to undergraduate students or graduate students who have that opportunity. So the goal then of the Catholic Theology Show is to open up a classroom. Maybe you have a professor who's taught a whole course on Augustine. How do you open that up for 55 minutes for kind of interested laity who can learn from some of the best professors either at Ave or around the country who come in for lectures and visitors and can kind of get a 55-minute dive into a whole class. Or again, a professor who's written a book on a topic, anything from, maybe marriage to the theology of Bishop Barron, or just so many different books that scholars have written that a lot of people don't have time to read. But if they can dive in for 55 minutes with an author, and so again, we have a lot of professors at Ave who have written books and a lot of scholars who come to visit. So I think that's kind of the idea, is to show that. And I think one of the key ideas actually goes back to C.S. Lewis. In Mere Christianity, C.S. Lewis says that if we don't have good ideas about God, we have bad ideas about God, often ideas that have been tried out by the tradition and found wanting. And so when we have these bad ideas or false ideas about God, our lives are harder than they need to be. And it's harder to find meaning and purpose. And so what I hope to do in the podcast is to help identify some of those bad ideas about God, those ideas that have been tried and found wanting, and try to show then the beauty and wisdom and meaning and purpose, right, that comes from the kind of truth that theology can offer, as it helps to kind of correct our maybe intuitive but often counterproductive views about God, ourselves, and our societies.
Mhm. Yes. And I did have the honor of interviewing, I think, Matthew Levering, who wrote the book on the theology of Bishop Robert Barron, and it was a wonderful, wonderful conversation.
Oh, that's
Um,
great.
and to your point, I, yeah, it's not something I'm proud to admit, but I did try atheism at some point in my life. And I find that I don't have enough courage or audacity to pursue that. So I guess that's how I became a Roman Catholic. And to your point also, I do find that there are not that many like uh, true atheists out there. Obviously, there are those who do not believe in Christianity or organized religion, but they have their ideas about God, and perhaps as per persons like Augustine or Irenaeus, these ideas about God can be mistaken. So, what have you found in, well, your professional as well as personal lives? Some of the ideas about God that people hold today that needs correcting.
Yeah, it's interesting when I interview my guests on the podcast. I ask them three questions at the end. What's a book you've been reading? What's a daily practice or regular practice you do to find meaning and purpose? And the third one is, what's a false idea you held about God? And then what's the truth you discovered? And so it's interesting to hear a lot of different people talk about that. And many people, I think, come up with, I would kind of categorize three ideas that I think are about God that are really understandable, but also unhelpful. One is the idea is that God is just very distant and uninterested. So kind of there's probably there's some driving force in the universe or some creative force, but it's not very interested in me. Kind of a deistic view. Maybe there's, you need to have some intelligence, but it's not loving and that's not personal. So, and again, it provides no meaning. I think another idea, and the Catechism describes this in paragraph 399 when it says that the result of original sin is that we develop a false image of God. No longer a God who can be trusted, but a God who is jealous for his own prerogatives, of whom we are afraid. And I think a lot of people will say when they go to church, what did they hear? They heard a message about this God who was very judgmental, unaccepting, kind of tyrannical or something like that. And I think what the Catechism shows is that's actually our understanding of God from original sin, from our wounded nature and our wounded societies. And sometimes, even the attempts to spread the message of mercy and of the gospel in the church doesn't overcome that bias in a way that we have. So I think that's the second one. And then, I think the third one is what I would kind of call like the false religion of secular hope, which is that you just kind of ignore the God question and you hope that you can somehow find meaning and purpose in this world, either through political revolution, through technological revolution. And then I think the fourth one is kind of a falling out of that, is when you lose hope in that, then you end up just with kind of despair and apathy and kind of fall into the pseudo gods of distraction, whether or not those are drugs, excessive use of video games or scrolling on media. But we're really looking for something to just kind of distract ourselves.
Yes, and in works like The Abolition of Man, right, C.S. Lewis sees this very clearly. This modern longing for God, but unadmitted, so to speak. So tell me more about how, in your view, man's desire is ultimately towards God.
Well, so Augustine speaks about this in the Confessions, right? He says, our hearts are restless until they rest in you. And right before that, of course, he says, Lord, you have made us for yourselves. And so if we are created by God, then it's not surprising that God and God alone would satisfy our longing and desire, because God made us not only to be in relationship with one another, but to be in relationship with him. And I think in a way, this kind of also is just confirmed by a human experience, which is that among everything, that we experience in the world, most people would say upon reflection that human relationships, when they are lived well and flourish and achieve that highest level of communion, are what makes life worth living. The toys don't make life worth living. The relationships really do. But at the same time, no human relationship is ever fully satisfying. And even those when we try to somehow make the other person almost into a god, sometimes which happens maybe through eros or other elements, when we first started, my wife and I first started dating, I was an atheist, and I think we kind of, in our early relationship, kind of almost thought that the other would begin to, and that relationship could satisfy all our longings. I think you just begin to recognize that, that human relationships don't. The people we love are fallible and mortal. They will die. And we are fallible and mortal. We won't live up to the best we can. And so some idea, I think this is, again, almost a kind of a human way of saying, well, there must be something more. And I think that's what C.S. Lewis really, identified so well in his Weight of Glory, where he says that we're created not just for human enjoyments, even in human relationships, but we're really created for something much more that we wouldn't know about except as revealed in the Gospels through the language of glory. But he says this, where he says, our Lord finds our desires not too strong, but too weak. We are half-hearted creatures, fooling about with drink and sex and ambition. when infinite joy is offered us, like an ignorant child who wants to go on making mud pies in a slum, when he cannot imagine what is meant by the offer of a holiday at sea, we are far too easily pleased.
Well, yes. I suppose the recurring theme of erecting idols to, in some ways, pursue our desires or justify our desires. It's a it's a human phenomenon. It has occurred throughout history and, of course, in the Bible as well. Um, I wonder, what is the central temptation for humans to erect these idols?
Maybe one way of considering it is that when we have this inner longing and desire, because God is not only God, but he's also the creator, creation itself also satisfies some of those longings. Creation was meant and is meant to be a good, right? Genesis, it was good, it was good, it was very good. Creation is a good that satisfies much of what we want. We are hungry and there's food. We're thirsty, there's water. We want, physical enjoyment and there's play. We want to express our creativity and, there's a garden and we want to guide and rule and there are animals. And then we want relationship and right, Adam, behold, there's a woman. And so we have all of this. We have the nurturing of children. So we have all these things that are good and are meant to be part of the world that we enjoy. Right? But fundamentally, God, who is the only one who can completely satisfy our desires, right? Not the gifts, but the giver of the gifts. God is also remote. He is also invisible. He is also somewhat, he is the cause of all things, the being of all things. But we have to look through those things to see him, right? The world is meant to be an icon in which we discover the presence and wisdom and order and love of God. But because of sin, because of our own prideful rebellion to want to make the world in our own image, that we've been, kind of inherited from the rebellious angels, right? I kind of see that icon, and instead of seeing God through it, I kind of turn it into a mirror and I see my own self, my ego, or my ego that edges God out of the picture, right? I see it's the pride of that's really at the root of all sin, according to the Bible, especially in Augustine and in Thomas, right? So pride then turns the world as I see it, and it sees it around me, that I'm the highest thing in the universe. And right, I think that's what Lewis talks about in The Problem of Pain and other places. And the problem is, so that pride then becomes a crushing weight, because if we're the highest thing in the universe, then there's nothing really that can save us. So we will kind of run after whatever we think can, whether or not it's money, political power, ideologues that come around, this king or that king. We end up sacrificing ourselves out of fear into an earthly good, right? And I think that's the world really that we know of sin. And I think much of what the Bible does is try to diagnose it, say like, you're unhappy. Let us show you why, right? C.S. Lewis in his Weight of Glory, when he talks about this one time, he says that when we don't follow this longing all the way to discover that it really points to God and to God alone. And he says, we see the things in the world that somehow elicit that desire: beauty, music, love, romance, excitement, whatever it is, right? These things, the beauty, the memory of our own past, are good images of what we really desire. But if they are mistaken for the thing itself, they turn into dumb idols, breaking the hearts of their worshipers.
What do you make of the role or the place of desire in the fall?
Well, I think we learn, right, that the desire, so I guess I'm going back a little bit to say Bonaventure's book, The Journey of the Mind to God, where he quotes Daniel, and he says that if we want to make the ascent to God, which he thinks St. Francis made, and he thinks we can make by imitating St. Francis. But then he goes on to say we're going to imitate St. Francis by kind of making a philosophical and theological ascent through the world, the image of God in the world, the image of God in us, and then the image of God in God. But he says we have to become a man of desires, vir desiderium, right? And so again, so Lewis is this idea that our desires are not too weak. I mean, are not too strong, but they're too weak, is very much from the tradition, right? From Augustine or from Bonaventure or from Thomas. And so I think the role of desire in the fall is not desire itself, is that the human creature has the ability to become aware of its own desiring, right? You know, dogs desire, dolphins desire, but they don't become a. So one of the things about human beings is that we can reflect upon our own desires. We become aware that not only, right, is it interesting to chase a bunny, but that I'm the one who am choosing to chase that bunny. And so then I can either choose the good because God is the one who made it good, right? Or I can choose the good because I'm the one who says it's good. Right. And that really, I think, is the heart of the fall. That's the heart of the rebellion of Satan. That's the heart of the rebellion of us. And that's in a way what the Bible does. You know, the story of the sin in Genesis 3 and 4, and I think Lewis does this really well. Yes, it is a historical fact, but it's also a mirror in which we're supposed to see ourselves and to see, wait a second, that's what I do. The reason why my life is hard and difficult and my relationships are hard and difficult is because instead of surrendering to God and creation and aligning my will with it, instead, I try to kind of shape creation in my own image, right? And I want to be the most important thing. And so again, it's not so much our desires, it's that when our desires are ultimately a way of ourselves entering into communion with the other, with creation and with God, or as Augustine would say, when they are incurvatus in se, when they are curved in upon, so my desires are ultimately always mine, right? You can even hear this in Lewis's friend, Tolkien, who would describe in Gollum, right? My precious, right? You're not really, what do we want? We want mine. And Lewis describes in The Problem of Pain, where he says the fall is ultimately pride, and pride is when we see ourselves as a noun and no longer as an adjective, no longer as a modification of the being given by God, but instead as something that we originated our own being and therefore our own meaning and purpose.
I think a lot about the arguments between Augustine and Pelagius. And of course, in hindsight, we know that Augustine won the battle. The argument being, well, to what extent how can we be saved? Augustine would say that because we are tainted by original sin, our salvation comes from God or Jesus Christ. Well, Pelagius would say that that is unnecessary because I suppose he believes that we are not tainted by original sin. We can work our way towards salvation. So in your view, why is this desire for salvation only achievable through Christ?
Well, I think the tradition, as it reflects upon this in Augustine and in the rest of the tradition, the Council of Orange, et cetera, really, it's kind of a reflection upon, you know, the way I sometimes describe it is we don't reason to the cross, we reason from the cross. We don't reason to the resurrection, we reason from the resurrection. And so we see that God has, and this is what the apostles preach in the book of Acts, is that, this man whom you killed, God raised from the dead. And now he is at the right hand of God the Father, and he has sent his Spirit for the forgiveness of sins, that we can become children of God. And Lewis as well, by the way, in his Screw Tape letters, at one point, right, says we have to avoid trying to turn Jesus into a historical object of like historical science, because he says really what the fundamental point is, the apostles went around the Mediterranean and the early disciples went around the Mediterranean describing one historical fact, the resurrection, and one theological doctrine, the redemption. And so really then, if that's the case, then that God has put us right through the resurrection, the death and resurrection of his son by sending his Spirit, then we all of a sudden recognize that, oh, I must have been in a really bad hole. It's not just that God didn't give us a good law, or that Moses wasn't a good prophet, or that Elijah and Elisha weren't good prophets, right? Or that even the Maccabees weren't trying to do the right thing. Just that we are impossible. We cannot keep up our side of the bargain. So of the covenant. So God has to establish, right, a new covenant. And then once you see the new covenant, you kind of can't unsee it. Once you see that Jesus Christ died and rose for me, then you recognize, oh, I could have never done that on my own, right? And I think it's the Catechism that says that the doctrine of original sin is in many ways really kind of hidden. It's not visible. You might just keep thinking, if we just tried again, we might get it right. But it's the flip side of the reverse side of the good news, right? The gospel that Jesus Christ is victorious over the enemies of sin and death. Right? That's the good news. And so I think it's really from that we begin to recognize, and we see something about ourselves that I think I'm not sure if it's Pascal, but he certainly writes a lot about this, that once we just see the original sin again, then all of a sudden we look back at human history and we're like, oh, of course, right? Of course we never quite get it right. Even good families create trauma, right? Even good societies do awful things, and bad societies do wicked things, right? It's in in Mere Christianity, Lewis says that basically he says, right, the whole of human history, I'm not going to find it right here. Oh, here it is. When Satan put into the heads of our remote ancestors what they could be like gods, be their own masters, set up on their own as if they had created themselves, invent some sort of happiness for themselves outside of God, apart from God. And out of that hopeless attempt has come nearly all that we call human history: money, poverty, ambition, war, prostitution, classes, empire, slavery. The long, terrible story of man trying to find something other than God, which will make him happy.
I suppose that brings me to another question, which is suffering a consequences? Is the consequences of I guess of false pursuits of desire, or of having desires that are warped in itself?
Yeah, so Paul in Ephesians will describe it as do not follow your deceitful desires. Our desires become deceitful because we become confused, right? We think that having what our neighbor has will make us happy, right? So we covet our neighbor's goods, our neighbor's, or what another person has, and whether or not that's on social media these days, or or Cain and Abel. It's just, right. But that desire is not real. It's an illusion, right? If we had what our neighbors had, we still wouldn't be happy, because we would want what our neighbors have. We actually want somehow. I have my very desire is colored through pride. And therefore I can't be happy because I want something that's not real. I want somehow to be God. Right. And so that I think is that idea of, right, that our very desiring when it's deceitful will necessarily lead to frustration and therefore to suffering. So that's the first side of it. Our deceitful desires lead to suffering. And the second thing is that, right, the world now has violence, it has death, it has brokenness, some of which is our fault and some of which is not our fault. Right? We have some of it that's just, I think Augustine does this beautifully, because somewhat like Pelagius, he agreed that part of sin came from our society. He just says that's not all of sin. So in the Confessions, he makes it very clear that he was born in a wounded state of an inability to speak to God, to confess to God, but also he's born then into a wicked society that's more confused and that makes him even worse, right? His friends make him worse. His education make him worse. So we really do have the sense that, wait a second, the world is really filled with suffering. And Lewis says that it's not so much that Christianity solves the problem of pain, it's that Christianity creates the problem of pain. Because the only reason why we would presume that there is a good, loving God is because we have a message of revelation through the prophets that a good, loving God created the world, that he has mercy on us, and eventually, right, in sending his son, promises us eternal life. So anyways, I think the sense of suffering is a huge issue. And I think we can talk a little bit more about this. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts. But when I'm teaching on, say, my theology classes or my humanities classes, these questions about modern philosophy and postmodernism, I think in many ways, postmodernism is rooted in a rejection of suffering, right? What postmodernism in part says, if there is suffering in the world, then I don't want to be a part of it. So I'm not going to tolerate any injustice. I'm not going to tolerate any cruelty, because I don't want to be in a world with I'm going to protest it, basically, right? And I think, in a way, that's a beautiful inspiration for a longing of a world that would be more than this world can offer, right? It's kind of like a Christian hangover, if you want to think about it. They see somehow, they heard the message from Christianity that a perfect world is possible, but then they said, no, but I'm not going to, I want it now. And so that root of pride, when it goes back to Satan, and sometimes it's said that Satan said non serviam, and St. Michael, the archangel, said serviam. I will not serve, I will serve. You can also think about it as Satan said non patiam, I will not suffer. Sin says, I will not suffer. If I suffer, I'm going to curse God, right? Like the thief on the cross that cursed Jesus. But what Jesus says when he comes into the world is not non-serviam, and not just I will not serve, or serviam, I will serve, but ultimately patiam, I will suffer. Right? It's Jesus's willingness to suffer out of love that is really redemptive. And so at the heart of that then is that we have, in a way, a world filled with suffering. The question is, where does it come from? Is it just part of the world, or is it part of something that happened due to sin? And that sin might have been the fall of the angels before even human beings were created, right? And before maybe our whole cosmos was created. And again, I think that we have that idea. We either have to, somehow try to find a little bit of meaning in the world, or we have to just, give up in a way, either in despair or protest, or we trust, right, this message that from the beginning it was not so, and that God has set about to put it right. And that has happened definitively in the resurrection, and it will happen, right, in the resurrection. unto eternal life at the end of time.
I always thought that Lewis implicitly seems to be repudiating some of the fashionable currents of German political thought or philosophical thought at the late 19th, early 20th century. I'm thinking about figures like Nietzsche and Hegel and Freud. I guess, respectively speaking, Nietzsche believes that the greatest error of Christianity is that it I suppose in his words tricks us into thinking that suffering means something, that our suffering means something because of Christ. Um, he, I think he is one of those people who believe that that can be transcended rather than to find to draw onto, I suppose. Of course, Freud takes that and makes it into a science, the science of analyzing why are we unsatisfied, unfulfilled. And Hegel, he holds steadfast in his belief that something amounting to Christian eschatology can be achieved without reference to Christian theology. He makes, I guess, lowercase history, capital H history. So in that way, in his theology and his Christian apologetics, Lewis rejects these rules. And as you've addressed earlier, it is a temptation to make Christ or Jesus a historical figure. Then, and that brings me to another question, which is, what is the role of Jesus in the course of human affairs?
Yeah, and I think so. Lewis will, at many times, I think one of Lewis's, it's kind of an interesting point because I think sometimes a lot of people get confused about this. So, right, he wants to say that Christianity is absolutely unique, right? It's a unique faith. He gets this, of course, just from the Christian tradition, but he was also very influenced by G.K. Chesterton's Everlasting Man, which he said baptized his intellect when he read it. Just a couple of years before his conversion. And, in that book, Chesterton makes two claims. One is that human beings are not just animals. And if you look at them as animals, you'll see just how not like other animals they are, right? They paint, they create civilizations, cave paintings and all these different things, right? So they're not really animals. They're very weird animals. And then he also says is we also are used to thinking of, so we think of animals evolving into man, and then we think of religions and Christianity as all one. And he says that the more you look at Christianity as another religion, the odder it looks because it's not like any other religion, right? All other religious founders came with a teaching to remind us of how we ought to live, right? Whether or not this is Muhammad or Buddha or so many others, or even Confucius and Aristotle and Plato, but only Jesus came really not to teach but to die, right? And so this is very unique, and Lewis will develop this point. And so I think that's what kind of starts Lewis off, is that human beings are not animals, which is ultimately what Nietzsche and Freud talk about, and Hegelian evolutionary kind of views, which he was kind of influenced by Hegel's idealism early on before he became a Christian. And I think he just saw that, wait a second, the evolutionary account of everything makes some sense because we see development. But when he talks about, he has an essay called The Funeral of a Great Myth. And he says, basically, the great myth of modernity is this evolutionism of everything. And he says, well, he's not talking about the scientific theory of the descent of life, but he says that things could only, death would only turn into life if it came from life, right? Acorns grow into trees because they came from trees. Machines get better over time because they come from the mind of God or the mind of human beings. So what he really challenges in a way this evolutionary mindset, or what he'll also sometimes speak about, he has an essay on transpositions where what Freud does is he says, well, we call it love, it's actually just lust. he says, well, what if not love is an imaginary thing of lust, but what if lust is a copy of the higher? And that's really one of his ideas, that you can't reduce the higher to the lower. The lower is a copy of the higher, because you couldn't have the lower have any meaning if there weren't a higher, right? In the world, even our animal appetites, right? And this is ultimately why he criticizes Nietzsche and the abolition of man, right? If any action if there's going to be any meaning or order, it's going to have to eventually go back to the whole moral law. So that's his one argument, is that just on a philosophical ground, human beings are not reducible to their appetites and their desires. They have something like reason that doesn't come from below, but it ultimately comes from above. So our reason and our desire and our moral order are three arguments for the existence of God, right? They don't come from below, they don't come from evolution, but they descend from on high. Okay. Then the second point is so what Jesus does is Jesus does not teach us those things, although you can learn them all in Christianity, which is great. But what Jesus does is somehow recognize that we're always wrong with reason, desire, and moral order, right? Even at the end, Lewis says at the end of where it'd say that Confucius's Analects, which he gives as an example of the moral law or the Tao, because Confucius will even say that no one has ever fully kept the Tao. Aristotle and Plato will say, right, Aristotle would say, well, virtuous friendships are the best, they're the most complete, but they're rare because virtuous men are rare, right? It's really hard to be happy. And we never know that anyone is fully happy in this life, because you'd have to see what happens to their offspring after they die. So we begin to see, wait a second, that there's something, our nature moves in a direction that it never actually is able to satisfy in this life. And that's when he says that's what Christianity is. Right? At the end of book one of Mere Christianity, he talks about how that if there's no moral law, and if there's no God, if there's no moral God behind the universe, then all our sacrifices are in vain. But if there is, we're on the wrong side of it. And we're not going to get any closer in the future. So we have a problem that without meaning and purpose, there's no meaning and purpose. But with meaning and purpose, we're on the wrong side. And he thinks that's the problem that Christianity solves. Because now what Jesus Christ has done in his death and resurrection puts us right with God, puts us right with our desires, puts us right with the moral law, right? Puts us right with the truth, right? In Jesus Christ, who is the way, the truth, and the life, we know how to live. And we live in the way Christ lived when we receive the life of Christ into us. And Lewis says we can do that right through belief and baptism and the Eucharist. The truth about God and the Creator, and therefore about the creation, is revealed in Jesus Christ. So I have to surrender to that. And then the life, right? The ultimate kind of satisfaction of the fulfillment of all our desires. So at least that's kind of how I think Lewis does it. He's not trying to say that Christianity is the only path to recognizing certain truths about the human condition. But he thinks it's the only one that kind of reveals them fully and solves the problem.
Yeah, you've mentioned postmodernism earlier, and I think in some of his texts, Lewis in some ways expects the coming of the postmodernist era, so to speak, because at its heart, postmodernism is the rejection of reason, and it is palpable to say that the rise of postmodernism is also a rejection of rationalism, or the deification of reason, so to speak. So you have these two currents, one that seeks to explain everything by reason alone, and one that rejects reason as a method of explaining anything. How does Lewis stand on this question?
Two things come to mind. One is at the beginning, when his first book that he wrote of his Christian journey, which is Pilgrim's Regress. It was an allegorical work of his conversion, and came out in 1935. In the foreword to that book, he basically describes, and he says that he followed rationalism as far as it would go. He followed romanticism as far as it would go. And he just found that both ultimately, romanticism made life kind of meaningful, but it couldn't provide truth. Rationalism, especially kind of as it went forward into even a kind of Hegelianism, was true, but ultimately meaningless. And so he saw that if you followed your desires, you would eventually see that all of those options were incomplete. And then when he encountered Christianity, he saw, wait a second, is almost like the word made flesh is kind of the truth made romance, right? The truth made story, and romance as a story, which is at the heart of romanticism, these stories that elicit beauty, wonder, fascination. Well, so what he was what he could not see as connected, romanticism and rationalism, he found came together in Jesus Christ. And he has that famous story where when he was one night when he was talking with Dyson and Tolkien, as friends, they said that he loved beauty and beauty and sacrifice whenever he read it in the myths, but not when he read it in Christianity. And Tolkien explained, right, that Christianity is just a true myth. It's a myth, not that is our human kind of dreams or visions or stories about God, but it's that it's God's story about himself. So it works on us like all the other myths insofar as it's moving, but it's actually not a man-made story. It's a God-made story, because this one actually happened. But this also gets him to see that Christianity is more than rationalism. It's more than reason, which is just true. Like our creed, Apostles' Creed, says certain things that are true. God is one. God is Father. The Son is God. The Holy Spirit is God. But it also talks about what God does. God creates the world. He sends his Son. His Son dies on the cross, suffered under Pontius Pilate, rises again. What does the Holy Spirit do? Well, it inspires the Holy Catholic Church, the communion of saints, the forgiveness of sins. Okay, so it's not just a series of facts. It's, in a way, it's a story. And so I think that's a very important way of Lewis recognizing that, at one other point, he will say that, for me, reason is the organ of truth, but imagination the organ of meaning. Imagination is not the cause of truth, but the condition of truth, right? And therefore, he says imagination needs to produce new stories or revivify old stories in order to help the truth continue. And I think in a certain sense, it's not the same, but you can see a little bit, those are the two impulses that I think almost begin to shape modernism and postmodernism, right? One, there is truth, but the truth is really the kind of truth that human beings master, right? Descartes will say that if we follow his philosophy, we'll become masters and possessors of nature, right? Which is fine. We can maybe with modern medicine, we can heal certain things that we couldn't heal before, but we can't give you a reason to live, right? But then the other problem is the people that are kind of just moving by, and I think postmodernism is often driven by immense amounts of pathos, right? This what Alistair McIntyre would describe as emotivism, right? I'm outraged. Right. I'm outraged over this injustice. Well, maybe, but you have to also then judge, right? Is the medicine you're going to use worse, or the cure you're going to use worse than the disease? Right. Well, again, we've kind of lost that. So anyways, I think Lewis sees that in Christianity, we can kind of hold those together because we stop trying to use our own reason or our own kind of imagination or romanticism as the arbiter of truth. But we let kind of God come down, and we have to somewhat surrender then and recognize much of what we try to do in this world is going to be provisional. It's going to be imperfect. I'm not going to, there's no way to come up with, to raise the perfect family, right? To be the perfect person, to create a perfect society, to create a global order, right? We have to really tolerate a lot of imperfections in this world, or we will make things worse, which is, the irony.
I'm sure Lewis sees this as well, but one thing I find the Christian story, the story of Christ, to be in some ways superior to all the myths that came before and after the Greek myths, the Nordic myths, and even the myth of capital H history as proposed by Hegel, is that in these other myths, human agency does not matter. It's insignificant.
Yes, yes.
And perhaps the outrage as motivated by emotivism, as per McIntyre, is in some ways a cri de coeur of the individual to say that I matter, I have some role to play in this story, whether it's the story of my life or the story of history, capital H. But for the story of Christ, we humans seems to play the role of well, our sins caused him to die on the cross, which makes us the ultimate villain. But at the same time, we are the most worthy of redemption, so which makes us the potential good person. I wonder, how would you reflect on this theme of agency in Lewis's most well-known works, The Chronicles of Narnia?
Yeah, I love that point. I think it's it's so important that Lewis identifies when we lose the moral law, and say in the Abolition of Man, we really, at first it feels like I'm going to become more of an individual because I reject tradition and I'm going to be freer. But he says that if we treat man as raw material he will be, but not raw material to be fashioned by himself as he fondly imagined, but instead to be shaped by the conditioners. And so the only way that I can be an individual is if I have moral worth. If there is a moral law, my obedience to the commandments matters, not my parents, not my children, not my society's, mine, right? Like this dignity of the person that is discovered in Israel, right, and continued in Jesus Christ. And I think Lewis sees in some ways, right, that in modernity and postmodernity, you lose that. And that's the irony, is modernity, which tries to enshrine the individual by idolizing the individual, you collapse what makes the individual an individual, namely God, right? And, he says this at the end of The Weight of Glory, there are no ordinary people, right? You have never talked to a mere mortal. Nations, cultures, arts, civilization, these are mortal, and their life is to ours as the life of a gnat. But it is immortals whom we joke with, work with, marry, snub, and exploit. Immortal ours or everlasting splendors. So this kind of the dignity of each person, as really, we are immortal, right? Societies will come and go, but each human being, an immortal, horror, or an everlasting splendor. And I think what Lewis does, by the way, is also very similar. I think the beauty of the, Lewis really helped and encouraged Tolkien to publish The Lord of the Rings. And he wrote when he was somewhat famous, he wrote an introduction or one of the blurbs, a book review of The Hobbit, encouraging people to read it. And if you think about The Lord of the Rings, you get that it's this massive, awful thing that's happening on the globe. Right? And yet it's a fellowship, a few friends, Merry, Pippin, you know, Frodo and Sam, their friendship, Legolas, Gimli, these little friendships of individuals, Gandalf, Aragorn, that actually changes the course of history. And I think Lewis does the same thing in the Chronicles of Narnia, right? It's you have, you know, right when in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, there's a war going on, and that's why the children are out in the countryside. And then they go and they discover there's a war in Narnia. But their actions, because their actions are not alone, because they're not merely animals, but because they're made in the image and likeness of God, and there is a power greater than themselves at work, right? There is a redeemer. Aslan is on the move. Then the Pevensie children play huge roles, and the little actions of Tumnus the fawn, of the beavers, each like that there is really good and evil. And when I teach the Narnia stories, and by the way, I have a 7-part series on the Catholic Theology show for those who are interested, kind of comparing them to his nonfiction writing as well. But it's almost as that within the world of Narnia, there isn't the fall that we've experienced. There's the enslavement by the witch, but the creatures are either good or evil. Some of the creatures are, it's basically more of a Pelagian world. Some of the creatures are good, some are bad, and some become bad and then become good, right? But to a certain extent, what Lewis is doing is saying in our world, good and evil are so conflicted that we almost begin to forget there is good and evil. But he says, no. Go to the world of Narnia, recover your imagination so you can hold on to the truth of free will, the truth of good and evil. And I'm going to show you lots of images and stories of decisions that people make. And so it's not just the forces. King Miraz is a bad king in Prince Caspian. Turns out he murdered his brother so he could become king. He did that. It didn't just happen because of the general forces of capitalism or something, right? You know, that happened in Voyage of the Dawn Treader. The various characters. Eustace, yes, he's somewhat a product of this bad modern education. But at the same time, when he encounters reality in Narnia, he has a choice to make. But we discover that the choice he wants to make to lose his sin, to lose his dragonness, is something he can't do on his own. But he has to want to do it. But when he wants to do it, then Aslan releases him. So I think this recovery of agency, this kind of that each of our lives are infinitely meaningful, which is why, again, our suffering can be meaningful. I think it's a beautiful point. And I think all the Chronicles of Narnia really kind of are a living embodied witness to that. The dignity of the person within God's overarching providential plan.
Well, I would like to end on this note. As I've alluded to earlier, I'm a convert to the Catholic Church, and you are as well. And of course, so is Lewis. Well, not Catholic, but Christianity. And some of my favorite Catholic and Christian theologians have been converts. Thomas Merton, Augustine, and of course, Paul, the Apostle. I always believe that conversion in itself a calling, but it's a calling that in some ways you have anticipated all your life without knowing. So I wonder, is that the same for you?
Yeah, it's a beautiful image. It reminds me of in the Till We Have Faces, Lewis describes Psyche as she's going to be sacrificed. She says, like, I think all my life, I feel like I was being called by the God of the mountain, right? That there was a longing, a desire. She said it was in her happiest moments that she was somehow looking for something more. And I will say that, I do have that sense that I was always looking for something more early on. I had, the death of a 2-year-old cousin, the death of a 20-year-old sister when I was young, a lot of suffering, a lot of just kind of generational suffering that occurs within this world. Grew up in the 70s and 80s when there was the kind of omnipresent threat of thermonuclear war, with the Soviets. And but I always had some kind of just this longing and this desire for they're like looking for meaning and purpose. And so I feel like, in many ways, God was that was a gift of God. That wasn't my own desire. That was a gift of God. And what God did was kind of, I was able to, kind of not give up on it. Not that I wasn't, but I kind of kept looking, so to speak. And then eventually realized, wait a second, why am I so frustrated with this world? Lewis has that in Mere Christianity where he says, I wouldn't know that a line was crooked unless I had an idea of a straight line. Right. So, and the big problem of pain, why is it that the injustice of the world bothered me so much? If it wasn't because I had in my heart this orientation to justice, order, goodness, beauty. Right. And so then I kind of see, wait a second, yeah, my very grounds for atheism were the kind of apparent meaninglessness and suffering of the world. And then you discover in Christianity, you realize, amen, exactly, that's right. There is a lot of suffering and meaninglessness in this world because this world is not as it's meant to be, right? This world, something has gone cataclysmically wrong with this world. And that's why God had to do something cataclysmically wrong by dying on the cross in order to rise again and set it right. So I don't know whether or not that's exactly what you're, what you're kind of like looking for. But for me, that's where I see it. And that's, I think, why when I read Lewis, I just love Lewis, because I think Lewis is kind of the master. I know of no one else who synthesizes so much of the great tradition. You read The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, and it's like you just got exposed to Dante's Divine Comedy. You read The Problem of Pain, and you just got a long treatise on Augustine. You know what I mean? He just kind of pulls together this, and not only is able to write it in prose, but then is able at the same time to write it in fiction. So I would never read Lewis alone, right? I'd read Lewis with the Bible, the creeds, Augustine, Aquinas. I love Aquinas. I teach Aquinas all the time, right? So I don't try to build a theology out of Lewis, but I think Lewis helps us to see what is part of the tradition, but often it's hidden. It's hard for students to see it in the scholastic language of Aquinas or the Italian poetry of Dante. So I think that, or even kind of the much more verbose English of Chesterton. Or even sometimes just the brilliance of Sheen. There's a lot of other people that have articulated these things, but I think Lewis as a whole is really helpful for awakening this. And so anyway, that's just something I wanted to kind of show those two coming together.
I think that's a very good note to end on. Thank you very much, Professor Michael Dauphinais of Ave Maria University, for joining the show.